The concept of democracy, with its emphasis on individual rights, citizen participation, and the rule of law, has gained near universal acceptance. It is seen as the most legitimate form of government. International organizations like the European Union and the African Union champion democratic principles. They often provide support for democratic transitions and elections around the world. The underlying belief is that democracy is essential for peace, development, and human progress. These organizations often set guidelines for democratic governance. They offer financial and technical assistance to countries transitioning to democracy. The promise of democracy is a powerful one. It envisions a world where every voice is heard and every citizen has a stake in their future. Despite the global push for democracy, Africa continues to lag behind. Many countries on the continent struggle to hold free and fair elections. Corruption is often rampant. Basic freedoms are frequently suppressed. This democratic deficit has real consequences for the lives of ordinary Africans. Without a functioning democracy, citizens have limited avenues to hold their leaders accountable. This can lead to a culture of impunity. Those in power can act with little fear of consequence. This lack of accountability further erodes trust in government and undermines democratic institutions. Furthermore, the absence of democracy often creates an environment where conflict and instability can thrive. When citizens feel that their voices are not heard and their grievances are ignored, they may be more likely to resort to violence. This can lead to civil unrest, insurgency, and even full-blown civil war. This is not to say that there are no democratic successes in Africa. There are certainly countries on the continent that have made significant strides in establishing democratic institutions and practices. However, the overall picture remains one of a continent grappling with significant challenges to democratic governance. The promise of free and fair elections, a cornerstone of any democracy, is often broken in Africa. Recent elections in countries like Nigeria and Sierra Leone have been marred by irregularities and violence. These incidents highlight the fragility of democratic processes in the region. In Nigeria, Africa's most populous nation, the 2023 general elections were widely criticized for widespread voter suppression, intimidation, and violence. The delays in the release of election results further fueled suspicions of manipulation. These issues have cast a shadow over the legitimacy of the electoral process and eroded public trust in the government. Similarly, Sierra Leone, a country still recovering from a brutal civil war, witnessed violent clashes between supporters of opposing political parties during the 2023 elections. The use of hate speech and inflammatory rhetoric during the campaign period heightened tensions and contributed to the post-election violence. These are just two examples of a much larger problem. Across Africa, elections are often characterized by a lack of transparency, widespread vote buying, and intimidation of voters and opposition candidates. These practices undermine the very foundation of democracy and deprive citizens of their right to choose their leaders freely. Section 4, the silence of the international community, a legacy of inaction. Despite the clear evidence of electoral malpractice and human rights abuses during elections in Africa, the international community often remains silent. International organizations, particularly those tasked with upholding democracy and human rights, have been criticized for their lack of effective action in addressing these issues. The European Union, for instance, often provides election observers, but rarely takes concrete steps to address electoral fraud or hold perpetrators accountable. Its focus on trade and economic partnerships sometimes overshadows its commitment to democratic principles. Similarly, regional organizations like ECOWAS, while vocal in condemning election-related violence, often lack the political will or the resources to intervene effectively. This inaction sends a dangerous message that the international community condones or is at least willing to overlook electoral malpractice in Africa. The reasons for this apparent apathy are complex. They range from a reluctance to interfere in the internal affairs of sovereign nations to a lack of political will to confront powerful individuals and governments. Whatever the reasons, the consequences of this inaction are dire. Section 5. The price of apathy, conflict, and the burden of peacekeeping. The failure to address the root causes of electoral violence and democratic backsliding in Africa has significant costs. When injustice and impunity prevail, it creates fertile ground for conflict and instability. This instability not only affects the countries directly involved, but can also have ripple effects throughout the region and beyond. Civil wars and armed conflicts, often fueled by political grievances and competition for resources, result in immense human suffering. Millions have been displaced from their homes, economies are devastated, the social fabric of nations is torn apart. The international community then finds itself forced to intervene, often at a great financial and human cost, in peacekeeping operations. These operations, while essential in mitigating the immediate impact of conflict, rarely address the underlying political and governance issues that led to the conflict in the first place. This cycle of violence and intervention is unsustainable and ultimately detrimental to both Africa and the international community. Section 6, a call to action, upholding democracy, peace, and justice in Africa. The international community must move beyond rhetoric and take concrete action to support genuine democracy in Africa. This requires a multi-pronged approach that addresses both the symptoms and the root causes of democratic backsliding. First and foremost, the international community must demonstrate a zero-tolerance policy towards electoral fraud and violence. This means holding perpetrators accountable, regardless of their political affiliations. Targeted sanctions, travel bans, and asset freezes can be effective tools in this regard. Secondly, there needs to be a greater focus on supporting independent institutions that underpin democracy, such as electoral commissions, judiciaries, and the media. This support should include capacity building, technical assistance, and financial resources to ensure their independence and effectiveness. Finally, the international community must prioritize conflict prevention over intervention. Investing in good governance, promoting human rights, and addressing the root causes of conflict will be far more effective and less costly in the long run. This requires a long-term commitment and a willingness to address difficult issues, including corruption, inequality, and the role of external actors in perpetuating instability. The struggle for democracy in Africa is ultimately a struggle for human dignity and justice. It is a struggle that demands the attention and support of the international community. The time for complacency is over. The lives of millions of Africans depend on it.